Okay. Well, I want to welcome to the My Kind of Leader podcast an inspirational leader that I find a warm and kindly person, Tara Nolan. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Emma. That's
Tell us
lovely.
a little. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. So I am the eldest girl of three. I always lead by saying I was my father's girl, and there's truth in that because I never actually felt the love of my mother, and it has persisted as a sort of old story for a very long time and still persists. Um, but what I saw in my dad was a humble man, a learned man, and a man that I liked to emulate. So I did my best as a kid to emulate by, equipping myself educationally, and I got strokes, if you will, or attention by my academic results and what I did in college and school because I followed my dad. I did economics in university and I did a master's in economics and was very proud of that. And then I did an MBA, and it chuffed him that I did that. So that's how I answer. But saying that, I loved Dad. I loved the world that Dad, spoke about, and that was always about economics and what worked in economies, etc. So I always knew that part of me would probably follow in that footstep. And yet there was a part of me that knew I was creative, knew there was something else, but I still persisted. I went into the business world. I became a foreign exchange trader. I worked for investment banks. Morgan Stanley was the one that I spent the most time with. And, I kind of surprised myself that I operated in those environments and worked in London and New York. I dropped off because I fell in love and went to the Cayman Islands. And that experience was phenomenal. I grew up in lots of ways there, fashioned an interior design role for myself. So I was quite entrepreneurial, quite able and resilient to, equip myself in the world and move around independently. And sitting in New York one day, my little sister had her first baby, and that was the sort of impetus for me to come back to Ireland and forge better relations with my own family. Because I wanted to be close to that first grandchild, to my nephew. And so I came back to Ireland in 2008 and I joined PricewaterhouseCoopers as head of executive search and selection because I've been working in the realm after, I probably should say to your guests, after investment banking, I went into headhunting. And then it was there in Ireland that, somebody said to me, you'd be really good as a coach. I didn't know what the word meant. And so in 2006, I plopped myself into the middle of America and started a course with Newfield Ontological Coaching. And there I really met myself. It was one of those incredible, formidable experiences, life experiences, where the content and what the leaders were shared back to me the lifelong beliefs I'd been living with. The belief that I was unlovable, and the belief that I was unworthy, and when that got opened up in me, I realized that, oh my gosh, this is the work for me, not only transpersonally and to help me transform as a leader, but also I really wanted, my mission then at least was to help people not suffer the way I had suffered. And what I mean by suffering is all the ways that I hid from myself, all the ways that I hid from others, and all the ways that I ran away, as opposed to confronting some of these, very sabotaging beliefs. And
Wow.
yeah, and so since my coaching course, I have been operating in my own business, and in 2014 then really generated out into team coaching. And a lot of it is equipping myself with that relationality piece of working in teams and with people.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's a phenomenal story. I mean, many might think that having a beginning like that, and it's really interesting that you started from how your childhood was, or some of how it was. Some might think that's an incredibly difficult place to bring yourself from, but now you have phenomenal success. You've really tested yourself in multiple industries and arenas. Now you run your own business. how did you overcome that struggle? Was that struggle anything to do with your success now, would you say? Those challenges that you faced?
So there's many ways, of course, as a coach to look at things and to reframe things and to look at them. And I would say one of the ways that I sort of meet with myself is to actually test myself. And so, you know, those tests were self-inflicted in many ways. Can I do this? Can I do that? You know, it's
Yeah.
almost like the perpetual feat of can I, you know, to sometimes stoke the demons in me, but also sometimes just genuinely see if I could. And so to answer your question, I think it wasn't until 2006 where I really stood in that room. I'll never forget it. There were 67 people as participants. And just to give you a little insight into you know, the transformation that occurred for me, I was standing in Newfield. There were in total 68 participants. I was one of them. And Julio Lala was the founder. And he had this sort of habit every day of, you know, inviting the audience to speak. And most people were gagging to speak, you know, share their stories, you know, have this guru coach solve them in a walk on the stage, etc. And I was the last and least person going to do that. I thought it would be just so shaming and so, and in other ways, I used to think it was so like, so egotistical. Why would you want to do that?
Mm.
But I remember he started talking about assessments and assertions, and it was one of those distinctions that just cut through me. And I remember asking for the mic, and of course, when somebody hasn't spoken for, you know, 6 modules, and all of a sudden she's raising their hand, there was a sort of a knowing in the audience, oh my God, this is going to be good, you know.
Yeah.
And so I, in that, you know, that heartfelt way and that way that I can sometimes be, I was just totally naked in front of my own words. And I shared, you know, the impact of the 2 assessments that I'd been living with that were in fact what I believed as truth. And in that room, I got this incredible outpouring of love. But I think, to answer your question, it was the place that was the pivotal turning point. It was then when I thought, okay, now I'm going to have to look at stuff at some of this, you know. I don't think it's uncommon, but, you know, the notion of psychotherapy and taking yourself off to psychotherapy was quite not done, you know, kind of
Yeah.
felt you were broken or whatever. But anyway, I did. And I think it's helped me really see myself and become much more self-aware. So I think the whole work that I surround myself, coaching and equipping myself to coach, has helped me develop my own inner landscape and understanding, and that's helped me, you know, in large ways overcome. I think it's uncanny too that, you know, only recently, 2 days ago, my mom and my sister came to me for counsel. So, I mean, that
Right.
that's sort of a, oh, there's something, you know, it's easy to do though, at the same time, you know, to be a coach to others, but to do it for yourself can be sometimes difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What would you say that's been the trickiest thing for you? Because we all have our blind spots, don't we? What not necessarily the trickiest thing. What was the most like the biggest revelation for you once you've seen through it? Because, like, bearing in mind the name of this podcast is that double meaning of kindness to self in leadership. We often don't realize there's a level of brutality to self. So what did you find? You go, what was an aha moment for you, if you feel like sharing it?
Absolutely. Well, you know, to be honest, you know, as a little girl, the way I interpreted my world and as a child was that I was being met with a lot of criticism, you know, and mostly meted to me by my mother. And so the environment that I was living in, I felt was scary and fearful, and wasn't very enjoyable. And I would levy, certainly in my 14, 15, 16 years of age girl, levy criticism of her, that she was overly critical and cruel and whatever. But what I didn't really appreciate was, of course, I was doing the same behaviors to myself, you know, probably even more magnanimously, you know. And so in wielding, in what I thought she was wielding control, I started to control me. And so, you know, I resorted to the brutality of, you know, denying myself food. I put myself on these incredibly harsh regimes, and I developed anorexia. In fact, I have had anorexia 3 times. Uh,
Wow.
and, that was cruelty of an order that I wouldn't wish for anybody. But
Right.
that sort of internal turmoil and how I was able to manage my anxiety in an environment that I didn't feel very comfortable was to wield brutality against myself, in the
And
harsh.
yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. That sounds um, really brutal, but of course it wasn't your fault. What can you do as a child? If you're met with any type of brutality as a child, the child will take that on as though it's themselves, which of course it isn't, but a young person doesn't know that. So that's why often we find in adulthood, we start reflecting on how we meet and treat ourselves within, and then we go, oh, right. And, I've met many leaders and I help many leaders with, look, you're meeting and treating yourself how you were met as a child. So now you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's all out of date and it wasn't yours in the first place. So we can't help that. What we can do as adults, I guess, is begin to know the brutality so that we can change it to kindness and companionability. And we've spoken before, so you have oodles of kindness for other people. How do you run your business as a leader that suits you and is companionable to you?
It's a lovely question. So truthfully, the reason initially, certainly, for excavating myself out to develop my own leadership was, born out of the anxiety of a lot of organizational life, and feeling like I was walking from, one toxic group into another toxic group in many ways, and not able to feel that I could fend myself. And of course, the inner languaging and inner conflict was roaring to a point where I felt, distance was a better, dignified distance is the phrase I often use with myself, is a way that I can manage myself. It's desirable sometimes to think, oh gosh, I'd love to go back into a company, corporate for the company and the collegiality, etc.
Mm,
But from the place that I have come, that can be really traumatic.
right,
What groups mean to me, what they can, is certainly initially anyway. So one of the ways that I've helped myself is develop my own business for myself. And so I think it's a lovely way, and you called it out for me, but it is a kind way for me to help myself be in the world in a way that doesn't run the risk. So, curiously, just last year, I found myself involved in an advanced program for group supervision. And of course, the exact same things was happening as soon as I walk into a group and I'm part of a group. When I'm leading a group, it's different. When I'm part of a group, and then I'm, with peers, I find that incredibly triggering. So I have to
okay,
really help myself, manage myself in that. Supervision, my own supervisor, my own psychoanalyst, all of those will help me. Um,
right,
so that's probably the one thing that I help. But I'm also kind to myself in a way that, initially, certainly starting out, as many people do in coaching, it's not an easy necessarily. I don't want to sound like this is an excuse. Um, but often coaching is not a very understood word, and so and domain, and it's certainly got traction now, and it's worldwide, and it's received and well, and but there's a plethora of charlatans in it, and there's a plethora of, so eking out an existence for yourself, and commanding a space in it where you are offering individual leadership and team coaching and making a living, and I have, is a measure of success. So I
sure,
have to remind myself that I've been operating here for nearly 12 years for myself, by myself. And one of my sort of standards is I still am able to afford my Prada clothes and my,
right.
my, my,
Yes, your measure.
my Gucci shoes. So if
Yeah,
I can do that, I'm okay. I can't be doing half bad.
right.
And I've got some phenomenal clients. So I think, it's lovely to hear you use the words warm and kind, because yesterday after I was concluding a supervision group, and one of the feedbacks that I got is, you ask great and hard questions softly. And I was like, whoa, that's lovely. I'll take that.
That is lovely.
Yeah,
That's a real compliment.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So that I love the work. And the other gentleman said, we have a real impact on individuals' lives. And I was like, thank you. That's huge. That's exactly why I'm in business.
Yeah,
help and see under and help people see themselves for what they are and who they are and what they could say to themselves. You know, I just even speaking with a leader this morning, just catching his slight self-deprecation and being able to just call it out just in the moment and help him see it, and then transform that into a kinder way to speak to himself, was for me
fantastic.
the work I do. And so I don't
That's
know if I
that's
am.
the bit we have in common, I suppose, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
I started to, well, working with leaders was accidental initially for me, but then I realized the impact. If you can help a leader be kind and companionable to self, they will therefore be able to be more freely kind and companionable to other people.
yeah.
And that's the impact of leadership. What I was going to ask you was, when you were talking about your triggers in a group situation, did it matter the level of trigger according to who was leading the group? So if you were in a team in a corporate, but the leader was particularly kindly, thoughtful, warm, did that matter to how your triggers were set off, or did that not have any impact?
So it's a great question. And as soon as you say that, I'm sort of brought around in my mind the various teams I've been part of. And, I would call out two teams in which I was in corporate life, where both leaders, to my mind, embodied kind and companionable leadership, as I've come to learn it from your book, Anna. And in those environments, my nervous system would settle. And with
Right.
people, my nervous system would be quite, because I think in both cases, I'm thinking of the leader of Morgan Stanley, the foreign exchange, and David Summers. I can call him out. I don't know where he is in the world, but
Mm,
phenomenal leader, just a phenomenal, the most caring leader, the most humble leader. And the other was Mark Carter. And again, I don't know what Mark Carter was head of tax for PricewaterhouseCoopers here in Dublin. And, under their wings, I felt safe and empowered and absolutely fine. It was more in the despotic leadership places that I just felt awful, you know,
right.
and I won't call them out, but
Sure.
in places like that, it was just run for the hills, and
Yeah.
exit as quickly as I could. Two in particular really were traumatic experiences, and
Right.
I wouldn't want or wish for those kinds of leaders, you know.
That's so
Anyway,
interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's really why I set this podcast up, because I'm so interested in how leadership affects the world for the better. Of
yeah,
course, it's a bit like when you do peace studies at university. Basically, you study war. So I've been studying kindness and companionability for years, and therefore I've studied brutality along the way also. But
yes,
I thank you for sharing that, because I think it's really important. I mean, I feel so strongly about, we share wonderful leaders, and also bearing in mind that leaders where there is brutality and cruelty, it most likely isn't who they are, but it's their work to do. If they really want to affect their teams, their colleagues, their world for the better, they've got to do that work. And of course, it's about inviting people to do that and be curious about it. You can't force it, because that's a type of brutality in itself, I suppose.
absolutely. Totally, in the two that I'm thinking that, when I was calling out the two that really worked for me and then the two that didn't, the two that didn't, you know, have such incredible shields. And one, for example, would share his own Fire B. Fire B is a fundamental interpersonal relationship orientation. And
Mm,
his desire for want of relationship was negligible, it was zero. And it goes, the score is 0 to 9. So that will give you a sense of almost the coldness that he works in the world. He only wants maybe one or two people in his environment. That's what he can tolerate. So, his ability to extend warmth as a consequence, to want or invite inclusiveness, is just too small. And yet he was leading an organization. I thought that was quite both insightful but also negligible at some level, because of the influence of his leadership on others. Like I suffered, I know many other people suffered. And
okay. And I guess that people will react differently to that, bearing in mind their own experiences, their own internal triggers, even those they're conscious of and unconscious of, I guess. But I'm sorry that you went through that. Um, did you take something in particular into your leadership, um, to ensure, in a sense, that you didn't pass that kind of thing on? Was it, you know, how people say, well, it was a real, I really learned from it, it was a terrible time for me, but I made sure that I didn't take that forward. Was there something in particular that you just, right?
Well, I think awareness is certainly one thing that you have to work with, and sometimes I think projection is a very important thing to understand and appreciate, because, you know, um, I think it's easy to criticize somebody for their controlling behavior and then not recognize it in yourself. And it's about, in what ways can I be controlling, and looking at that very assiduously is really important. Um, uh, I think, I'm thinking of my own leadership, for example, in various different organizations, and just being really conscious of the kind of leader I am, how am I, and getting feedback on it, was really important, because of course I can have my own wobbles and foibles, and it's how you come back from that and how you help people see that, it was an aberration or whatever. So I'm thinking of examples of I was an interim head of learning and development in this particular organization. I can't name it now because it'll be so obvious, but I remember, without my knowing, and when they changed my table in the office, in other words, I had it kind of like, if I can describe it to your listeners, it was like a beautiful corner suite table. And all of a sudden I walked in one day and there was this wonky half table, and it was one of those things that was just incredibly triggering. And today I can't tell you exactly what it is. You might interpret that as status or whatever, but it felt so disrespectful that you wouldn't, one, tell me that this was going to
Right.
happen and why, and then, and then think that a wonky broken table would be okay in replacement for something that was really gorgeous. It was like,
Yeah.
but what I wasn't proud of was my immediate reaction to it, which was quite volatile.
Right.
And but I think what with everything in all leadership, it's recognizing, actually in that moment I was wrong, I was triggered, and then what you do with that afterwards is what's important. And I did, I was able to acknowledge my own, weirdness in that, and then apologize. And of course you've broken trust at some level, because they're looking at you going, who is this wacko, having an emotional meltdown about a table. But
But
I
the
think,
feelings aren't wrong, right?
no,
I say this every working day of my life, the feelings aren't wrong. And lots of leaders don't have all of their emotions available to them. And in fact, they practice thwarting them so they don't have an explosion, or don't do, have the impact that they don't want, or be transparent to people. But yes, your feeling about that wobbly desk or table wasn't wrong, but then what we do with it, I guess that's, so what you learned was, right, so I will be conscious of my reactions, what I do with my feelings. Yeah.
yeah, no, I've
That's
got,
all you can ask, I suppose.
yeah, no, I mean, I've got, there's a lovely frame I use. It comes from conscious business, and, it's sort of a little mini reflection exercise that I do pretty much with everything. But, what's important to me about this situation? What's at risk for me in this situation? And how do I feel about it? And literally, doing that analysis post anything or even before something can really help you get to your core truth about something and then speak it. And so that's what I got good at, and yes, there are moments when I'll do that. I'll have the emotional outburst, and then I'll do the reflection, and then I'll go back into the conversation. I'll go, listen, here's what I was trying to communicate, and that didn't work yesterday, but this is what I really mean, and be heard.
Right. And not all outbursts are bad, right? It depends where they go to.
Yes, absolutely.
If you need to have an outburst and it's kind of going nowhere into the world, but when I guess if there's people around and it lands on them, that becomes the issue.
Yeah.
So yeah, needing to have the odd explosion's not a bad thing, and it's over so quickly.
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, in that situation, I didn't have it in front of anybody. It was with myself. So, you know, yeah. but I've used it every time as just, that, getting really clear about what your emotions are sharing with you. That was the beauty of my learning in Newfield anyway. The domain of language, the domain of emotions, the domain of the body, the domain of your environment, and just, being able to be fluid in those, to know, what's anger telling me right now.
Yeah.
It's there, it's present, and, I'm noticing my own anger right now. So what is it? And I use that a lot in my coaching.
Yeah. And anger is not a bad thing. It's one of the 10 emotions. So it has to be had.
Yeah.
We can't get rid of any of the emotions. We can just learn that we're having them.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, maybe you get a hold of why sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important point, because I find it in the profession that is coaching, in the profession that is leadership, there's a skewed relationship to what are perceived as negative emotions. And I want to disabuse people of that, candidly. I think anger is a good emotion. All emotions have a purpose, I should say. You called out 10, I might say 6, there's 4, whatever it is you think or believe in the world that is our emotional field. All emotions give great information. And I only had a conversation yesterday where this gentleman, a leader, was afraid of there being an emotional, meltdown or emotional outpouring. And I'm like, you need to allow for emotions. Emotions are really powerful information force fields.
Well, they are us. If we're not emoting, we're not anything.
Yes.
Right.
But it's
If
uncanny.
Yes, I think it's a fantastic subject. It's like a whole another conversation, really. That whole you cannot lead without emotion there.
Yeah.
Because what are you? Because your emotions are your interpretation experience going through the world. Otherwise, you're thinking through the world only. And of course, I think the best leaders are those that are a lovely marriage between the intellect and their emotional world.
Yeah.
And that they know that there isn't good or bad. It's only what you do with it.
Yeah. But I'm not joking when I say the shadow of coaching is such that a lot of coaches try to sugarcoat and not deal with the very beautiful terrain that is anger or frustration or,
Yeah, of course. And of course, well, the coaching industry, I think in a way it did itself a disservice by, looking at positive mindsets only and growth mindsets, whatever this actually means to people. It probably means different things. But to tell people, or even the happiness mindset, you see, if you do that, what you're actually saying is you're disregarding every other emotion that's there in the palette. So I guess that's a tricky one. Is there something, Tara, that you'd say, let's say you get to decide what the coaching industry discusses about leadership this year.
Oh,
What's the imperative in your mind's eye? And you can choose.
Oh, it's a great question. The imperative, I guess, I mean, the backdrop that we're certainly living is so uncertain, is so wobbly, to use my, non-scientific word, is so precarious, whether it's Ukraine and the implications of Putin and the rest of the world, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Boris and us in Europe, whether it's Biden, his health or non-health, and the divisive nature that we're seeing in the political field that is the USA, climate change, and what we're seeing and witnessing in the world, and the heat, like the unprecedented heat temperatures in Europe right now for May, June. So that backdrop, and the very great risk that, for example, today many concerts here in Ireland are being cancelled because of the uptick in COVID. So we've got COVID rearing its head again. We thought we'd put it to bed, but actually it's probably going to be persistent,
Yeah.
As an ever. And I think the dialogue too that is current out there about hybrid working and, the big resignation and the huge acknowledgement about the persistent nature of stress and trauma in the workforce, and maybe more importantly, in the younger cohort of individual. That's an incredibly cocktail of concerns to be dealing with from a leadership point, and trying to navigate through that in terms of leadership, of which there are many really good and successful stories. So that's a roundabout way of saying I think context is critical, and then layering on that, I think, and of course you might say, well, you would because you're a team coach, but I think the collective and co-creation and care are probably the 3 C's that I would think are really important to equip yourself with on a team today, to be able to deal and navigate through this cocktail, of uncertainty. And care, I think, is an incredibly important value, to really care. And it's one of the pillars of trust in any case that I call out. I did a lovely podcast with Charles Feltnam, and we were talking about trust. And the 3 other pillars of trust are sincerity, reliability, and competence. But care is one of those that we often maybe don't think about as a trust component. So I think of it as very important in the sort of glue that binds a team together really well. If we care for each other, if we care for the success of the organization and the people that we are leading, and we take responsibility and ownership for that mandate that we've been given, then we can exercise our competence and we can be reliable and sincere in what we're doing. So I think there's been probably, I mean, I know the hierarchical hero-led leadership model is supposedly dead, but I think it's still quite alive in many organizations, that top-down hierarchical construct. And I think we have to disavow ourselves of that and get really more networked, much more of an ecosystem, thinking about teams of teams, and inspiring that collective knowledge gathering through that teams of teams ideas. And so you have to do that, to my mind anyway, equip yourself as a leader with less ego and,
Right.
and more about that. Well, I'm presiding over an organization, but I'm willing and wanting contribution. So I'm going to co-create, I'm going to collaborate, I'm going to encourage those disciplines, so that we can make something here. And we're going to do it with a source of care.
Well, I love that. That's so important. So that leader would be caring to share that powerful position, that caring to co-create a culture, caring to create that solidarity. That's lovely. I really, really like that. I think that's a really good place to ask you, if people wanted to find you, bearing in mind that level of consideration and care and support you give to teams and leaders on their own, where can people find you? Where do you hang out? What's your website? Things like that.
Sure. Well, I have 2 websites, and one is called Tara Nolan Limited, so it's www.taranolan.ie, and the other is The Game of Teams, and that's where I populate a website with my podcasts and my show notes. And so you can reach me there as well. So that's www.thegameofteams.com, and or on LinkedIn. And yes, I genuinely am really about care, co-creation and collaboration on teams. And I'm not naive enough to know that there is work to be done. It's not like this is a kumbaya, bonfire type arrangement for teams.
Right.
It's for the sake of what do we want to be caring with each other? For the sake of what do we want to co-create and collaborate? What's our definition of success? And how can we build processes and be together to support that?
Right. So as a closing note, what's your definition of success for yourself? I know how you measure it because you can still buy your Prada and stuff. What's the definition of success for you?
That's a really, really lovely question. The definition of success is that I am myself caring for the impact that I have on the teams that I work with and the individuals that I work with, and always reappraising that for my success. Definition 2 is that I am, despite myself, wanting to be the lone trader and being alone, that I collaborate and learn from each other. I mean, learning is so important to me. So I need to go out in the world and learn. I want to be current. And so
Right.
connection and collaboration, I think, are so important. And also, I think the definition of success for me is that I don't take myself too seriously, and I start, having fun. And
Right.
I remember that life is for living, because I can be too attached to, my work and allow it to give it my identity, rather than saying that, I'm a person of frivolity and fun, and I enjoy life. And I've let my yoga, for example, go. If any yogis are listening, they'll go, "Oh my God, I can't believe that." But I'm a yoga teacher, trained yoga teacher, and I haven't practiced yoga for a few months now. So, success for me will be bringing those kind of things that I love to do back in balance.
Uh-huh. And balance is so hard to achieve, right?
Yeah,
But I love the idea of this frivolous you, that the fun bit, and adjusting to have some balance sometimes, I suppose. Listen, Tara, thank you ever so much for this discussion, and I feel like there's going to be more chats between us for sure. And all of your details will be in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming along.
you're so welcome. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon. Bye now.